Stray Kitten refuses to leave old man's side. Their bond is unbelievably beautiful. How will this story unfold? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. The park was quiet, the early morning sun casting long shadows across the grass. Walter sat on his usual bench, his hands resting on the polished wooden cane he always carried. His eyes, framed by a network of fine wrinkles, were fixed on the horizon, where the trees swayed gently in the breeze. It was his routine, sitting here every morning watching the world go by. Walter was a man of simple habits. He had lived in the same house for 40 years, worked at the same factory until his retirement, and walked the same path to the park every day. But life, he often thought, had grown smaller with time. Since losing his wife, Mary, 5 years ago, the days had stretched long and empty. The laughter that once filled his home was now a faint echo, and his only companion was the solitude that clung to him like a shadow. Today was like any other morning, until it wasn't. As Walter unfolded the sandwich he had packed for himself, he noticed a flicker of movement out of the corner of his eye. He turned his head and saw a small, scruffy kitten crouched near the edge of the park path. Its fur was a patchwork of browns and blacks, matted and dirty, and its eyes, wide and green, watched him with a mix of curiosity and caution. Walter blinked, surprised. It wasn't often that anything unexpected happened in his quiet little park. He sat still, not wanting to startle the tiny creature. The kitten took a tentative step forward, its nose twitching as it caught the scent of the food in Walter's hand. Walter smiled, a faint warmth spreading through his chest. "Well, hello there," he said softly, his voice barely louder than the rustling leaves. The kitten froze at the sound of his voice, its body tensing as if ready to flee. Walter waited, his movements slow and deliberate, as he tore a small piece of his sandwich and placed it on the ground a few feet away. "Go on," he said gently. "It's all right." For a long moment, the kitten didn't move. Then, cautiously, it crept forward, its tiny paws barely making a sound on the gravel path. It sniffed the morsel of food, then snatched it up and retreated a few steps, chewing quickly as if afraid it might be taken away. Walter chuckled softly. "You're a smart one, aren't you?" As the morning wore on, the kitten lingered nearby, watching Walter from a safe distance. Walter, for his part, found himself talking to the little creature as if it could understand him. "I used to have a cat, you know," he said, his voice tinged with nostalgia. "A big orange tabby named Milo. He loved to sit on Mary's lap while she knitted. Haven't had a pet since she passed." The kitten tilted its head, its green eyes fixed on Walter as if listening. Walter smiled, feeling a flicker of connection in the kitten's steady gaze. For the first time in a long while, he felt as though he wasn't entirely alone. When it was time to leave, Walter stood slowly, his joints protesting the movement. The kitten watched him, its tail flicking back and forth. "I'll be back tomorrow," Walter said, as if making a promise. He began his slow walk home, his cane tapping against the pavement with each step. To his surprise, when he glanced over his shoulder, the kitten was following him. It stayed a few feet behind, its movements cautious but determined. Walter chuckled, a soft sound that felt strange in his throat. "Well, I guess you're coming with me, then," he said. Walter's walk home felt different that day. The familiar path, lined with old oaks and dotted with wildflowers, seemed livelier with the kitten trailing behind him. He glanced back occasionally, chuckling softly as the little creature darted into the shadows whenever he turned his head. It was cautious, yes, but determined. There was something endearing about its persistence. When Walter reached his small, weathered house, he paused at the gate, looking back one last time. The kitten had stopped a few steps behind him, its tiny body half hidden behind a bush. "You're welcome to come in," Walter said, his voice warm but unsure. He didn't expect the kitten to understand, but to his surprise, it stepped forward cautiously, its green eyes locked onto his. Walter opened the gate and made his way to the front door, leaving it ajar as he stepped inside. He didn't want to scare the kitten, but he wasn't entirely sure it would follow him, either. Setting his cane against the wall, he shuffled into the kitchen and placed his sandwich bag on the counter. He turned around, half expecting to see an empty doorway. Instead, the kitten was there, standing just inside the threshold. Its small frame looked even smaller against the backdrop of the house, its fur damp from the dewy grass. Walter smiled, a soft, genuine smile that he hadn't felt in years. "Well, look at you," he said. "Brave little thing." He moved slowly, not wanting to spook the kitten, and rummaged through the cupboard. He found an old saucer and poured a bit of milk into it. "This should do for now," he said, setting it on the floor a few feet away from the kitten. The tiny creature hesitated, its nose twitching as it sniffed the air. Then, with careful, measured steps, it approached the saucer and began to drink. Walter watched, his heart warming at the sight. He pulled out a chair and sat down, his knees creaking in protest. "You remind me of Milo, he said, his voice soft. "He was a scrappy little thing when we first found him, too. Mary said he had the heart of a lion." The kitten finished the milk and sat back on its haunches, licking its tiny nose. It seemed more at ease now, its body less tense as it looked around the room. Walter chuckled. "I suppose you'll want to explore," he said. "Go on, then. Make yourself at home." For the rest of the afternoon, the kitten roamed the house, its curiosity leading it to every corner and crevice. Walter found himself following its movements, smiling as it batted at a loose thread on the rug or climbed onto the windowsill to peer outside. It was a small, simple joy, but one that filled the quiet house with a sense of life and warmth. As evening fell, Walter prepared his modest dinner, a bowl of soup and a slice of bread. He set a small dish of scraps on the floor for the kitten, who eagerly devoured them. Afterward, the two of them settled into the living room, Walter in his worn armchair and the kitten curled up on the floor nearby. The soft glow of the lamp cast a warm light over the room, and for the first time in years, Walter felt a sense of peace. He glanced down at the kitten, now fast asleep, its tiny body rising and falling with each breath. "You're a funny little thing," he said quietly. "Didn't think I'd have company again. But I'm glad you're here." The days that followed brought a new rhythm to Walter's life. Each morning, he would sit on the porch with his coffee, the kitten by his side. He decided to name it Patches, after the mismatched colors of its fur. Patches seemed to like the name, responding with a soft meow whenever Walter called. The townsfolk began to notice the change in Walter. The man who had once seemed withdrawn and somber now greeted his neighbors with a smile, Patches perched on his lap or trailing behind him. Children in the neighborhood would stop by to pet the kitten, their laughter filling the air as Patches played with their shoelaces or batted at their fingers. One afternoon, as Walter sat on his porch with Patches curled up on his lap, his neighbor, Mrs. Caldwell, stopped by. She was an elderly woman with kind eyes and a knack for gossip, but her tone was warm as she said, "That little one has brought some life back to you, Walter." Walter chuckled, scratching Patches behind the ears. "I suppose it has," he admitted. "Funny how something so small can make such a big difference." Mrs. Caldwell nodded. "It's good to see you smiling again. That kitten's done wonders for you." As the weeks turned into months, the bond between Walter and Patches deepened. The kitten followed him everywhere, from the park to the grocery store, earning smiles and laughter from everyone who saw them. Walter found himself talking to Patches as if it were an old friend, sharing stories about Mary and Milo, about the life he had lived before the loneliness set in. One rainy evening, as the two of them sat by the fire, Walter spoke softly. "You know, Patches, I think Mary would have liked you. She always had a soft spot for strays. Said they were the ones who needed love the most." Patches meowed in response, as if agreeing, and Walter smiled. "Maybe you were meant to find me," he said. "Or maybe I was meant to find you." The turning point in their relationship came one cold winter morning. Walter had caught a nasty cold, leaving him bedridden and weak. For the first time since Patches had entered his life, Walter couldn't take him to the park or sit on the porch. He felt guilty, worried that the kitten would grow restless or bored. But Patches surprised him. The little cat refused to leave Walter's side, curling up on the bed beside him and purring softly. Whenever Walter stirred, Patches would nuzzle against his hand, offering comfort and warmth. It was as if the kitten knew Walter needed him now more than ever. In the days that followed, Walter's health slowly improved. Each morning, he woke to find Patches still by his side, his loyal companion through it all. The bond between them had grown even stronger, their connection unshakable. Walter often reflected on how much his life had changed since Patches had wandered into the park that day. The loneliness that had once consumed him had been replaced by a sense of purpose, a reason to wake up each morning. Patches had given him more than companionship. It had given him hope. Winter melted into spring, and with it came a sense of renewal. The trees outside Walter's house began to bloom, their branches heavy with blossoms that swayed in the gentle breeze. Walter, now fully recovered from his illness, found himself more energized than he had felt in years. Each day began with a walk through the park, Patches perched proudly on his shoulder or trotting alongside him, her tiny tail held high. The townsfolk had grown fond of the unlikely pair. Children would run to greet them, offering treats for Patches or chatting with Walter about their day. Even the grumpiest of neighbors couldn't help but smile when they saw the old man and his kitten strolling through town. Walter's life, once defined by routine and solitude, now seemed full of color and joy. One afternoon, as Walter and Patches sat on their favorite bench in the park, a young woman approached them. She held a sketchbook under her arm, her eyes bright with curiosity. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice kind. "Would you mind if I sketched the two of you? You make such a lovely picture." Walter blinked in surprise but smiled. "I don't see why not," he said, glancing down at Patches, who was curled up in his lap. "What do you think, girl? Feel like being famous?" Patches meowed softly, her green eyes half closed in contentment. The young woman laughed and sat down a few feet away, opening her sketchbook and beginning to draw. Walter watched her work, her pencil moving quickly across the page. It felt strange, being the subject of someone's art, but also oddly flattering. When the young woman finished, she held up the sketch for Walter to see. It was a beautiful rendering of the two of them, capturing not just their likeness but the warmth and bond they shared. Walter's eyes misted over as he took in the details, the gentle curve of Patch's body, the softness in his own expression. "This is wonderful," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." The young woman smiled. "It's my pleasure. You two have such a special connection. It's inspiring." She handed the sketch to Walter, who held it carefully as if it were the most precious thing in the world. "I'll treasure this," he said. "You've captured something very dear to me." Back at home, Walter found a simple wooden frame for the sketch and hung it on the wall in his living room. It became a centerpiece, a reminder of the journey he and Patches had taken together. Every time he looked at it, he felt a swell of gratitude for the little kitten who had wandered into his life and changed it forever. The days passed in a blur of quiet joy. Walter and Patches fell into an easy rhythm, their bond growing stronger with each passing moment. Walter began to share more of his life with the kitten, telling her stories about his past, about Mary, about his years working at the factory, and about the dreams he had once had. "You know, Patches," he said one evening as they sat by the fire, "I used to want to travel. Mary and I always talked about taking a trip across the country, seeing all the places we'd only ever read about. But life got in the way and we never did." Patches purred softly, her green eyes fixed on Walter as if she understood every word. Walter chuckled. "Maybe it's not too late," he said. "Maybe you and I could go on an adventure someday." The idea, once spoken, took root in Walter's mind. He began to make plans, sketching out routes on an old map and making a list of places he wanted to visit. The Grand Canyon, Yellowstone, the beaches of the Pacific Northwest. Each destination seemed like a new chapter waiting to be written. Patches watched him work, her tiny head tilting in curiosity as Walter explained his plans. "We'll travel light," he said, scratching her behind the ears. "Just you and me, seeing the world one step at a time." But before they could set off on their journey, life had one more surprise in store for them. One crisp morning, as Walter and Patches walked through the park, they heard a faint, pitiful sound coming from the bushes. Patch's ears perked up, and she darted ahead, her small body moving with purpose. Walter followed as quickly as his cane would allow, his heart racing as the sound grew louder. When they reached the source of the noise, Walter's breath caught. Nestled among the leaves was a tiny kitten, even smaller than Patch's had been when they first met. Its fur was matted, its body trembling with cold and fear. Patch's approached the kitten cautiously, sniffing it gently before curling her body protectively around it. Walter knelt down, his joints protesting the movement, and carefully scooped up the tiny creature. "Well, would you look at that," he said softly. "Another little wanderer." He carried the kitten back to the house, Patch's trotting beside him with an air of importance. Once home, Walter set to work making the new arrival comfortable. He cleaned its fur with a warm, damp cloth and offered it a saucer of milk, which it drank eagerly. Patch's watched the entire process with keen interest, occasionally nudging the kitten with her nose as if to reassure it. Walter decided to name the new kitten Scout, after the character in one of his favorite books. Scout was shy at first, but under Walter's care, and with Patch's as a mentor, it began to thrive. The two cats became fast friends, their playful antics filling the house with laughter and life. For Walter, the arrival of Scout felt like a gift, a reminder of how far he had come since the days when loneliness had been his only companion. His little family had grown, and with it, his sense of purpose and joy. The dream of traveling still lingered in his mind, but for now, he was content to savor the simple pleasures of home. The community, too, took notice of Walter's transformation. People would often stop by the house to visit, bringing treats for Patch's and Scout or simply sitting on the porch to chat with Walter. His story, of how a stray kitten had changed his life, became a source of inspiration, a testament to the power of kindness and connection. As the seasons changed, Walter found himself reflecting more and more on the journey he and Patch's had shared. The sketch on the wall, the laughter in the house, the warmth in his heart. All of it traced back to the moment when a tiny kitten had appeared in the park and refused to leave his side. "You've given me so much, Patch's," he said one evening, his voice filled with gratitude. "More than I ever thought possible. You and Scout, you've made my life full again." Patch's purred in response, curling up in Walter's lap as Scout played with a ball of yarn nearby. The house, once so quiet and still, was now alive with the sounds of love and laughter. Spring turned to summer, and with the warmer weather came a sense of renewed energy for Walter. His house, once quiet and somber, now seemed alive with activity. Patch's and Scout filled his days with their playful antics, chasing each other through the house or curling up together in sunny spots by the window. Walter couldn't help but laugh as he watched them, their joy infectious. One morning, as Walter prepared his coffee, he glanced at the map he had pinned to the kitchen wall. The routes he had traced were still there, the places he and Mary had dreamed of visiting. "Maybe it's time," he muttered to himself. "Maybe we're ready." He turned to Patch's and Scout, who were busy playing with a loose shoelace on the floor. "What do you think, girls?" he asked, his voice teasing. "Feel like going on an adventure?" Patch's looked up at him, her green eyes bright with curiosity. Scout followed suit, letting out a tiny meow as if in agreement. Walter chuckled. "I'll take that as a yes." The weeks that followed were filled with preparation. Walter dug out an old travel bag and began packing essentials. A few changes of clothes, a camera, and supplies for Patch's and Scout. He borrowed a small camper van from a neighbor, making sure it was equipped to accommodate his two furry companions. The excitement of planning brought a spring to Walter's step, and the neighbors noticed the change. "You're really going through with it, huh?" Mrs. Caldwell said one afternoon, leaning over the fence that separated their yards. "Taking the cats on a road trip?" Walter nodded, a proud smile on his face. "Why not? It's something I've always wanted to do. And they're good company." Mrs. Caldwell shook her head, but her smile was warm. "You're an inspiration, Walter. Most people your age wouldn't dream of doing something like this." "Well," Walter said with a chuckle, "I've got a lot of living left to do." When the day of departure finally arrived, Walter felt a mix of nerves and excitement. He loaded Patch's and Scout into the camper, securing their carriers in the back before settling into the driver's seat. "Here we go, girls," he said, starting the engine. First stop, the Grand Canyon. The drive was peaceful, the hum of the engine blending with the soft purrs of Patches and Scout. Walter marveled at the changing landscapes outside his window. The rolling hills, the sprawling plains, the towering mountains. Felt good to be on the road, to see the world beyond his small town. When they reached the Grand Canyon, Walter was struck by the sheer beauty of it. The vast expanse of red rock stretched as far as the eye could see, a breathtaking testament to the power of nature. He stepped out of the camper, carrying Patches and Scout in their carriers to a quiet spot overlooking the canyon. Setting the carriers down, he opened the doors and let the cats out. Patches stretched luxuriously, her tail flicking as she sniffed the air. Scout, still a bit timid, stayed close to Walter, her tiny body pressed against his leg. Walter knelt down, stroking their fur as he gazed at the view. "What do you think?" he asked. "Pretty amazing, isn't it?" Patches meowed softly, her green eyes wide with wonder. Scout let out a tiny purr, her trust in Walter evident. The three of them sat together, taking in the beauty of the moment. Their journey continued, each destination more awe-inspiring than the last. Walter took them to Yellowstone, where they marveled at the geysers and watched bison roam the plains. They visited the Pacific Northwest, where the lush green forests and misty coastlines filled Walter's heart with peace. Everywhere they went, Patches and Scout adapted quickly, their bond with Walter growing stronger with each passing day. At night, they would settle into the camper, Walter sharing stories from his life as the cats curled up beside him. He spoke of Mary, of his years working at the factory, and of the dreams he had once had. Patches and Scout listened quietly, their presence a source of comfort and companionship. "You two have given me a second chance," Walter said one evening, his voice filled with gratitude. "A chance to live the life I always wanted. I'll never be able to thank you enough for that." As the weeks turned into months, Walter began to notice something remarkable. Everywhere they went, people were drawn to Patches and Scout. Strangers would stop to pet them, their faces lighting up at the sight of the two cats perched on Walter's shoulders or sitting contentedly in his lap. Children laughed and played with them, while adults marveled at their calm demeanor and the bond they shared with Walter. The story of the old man and his two cats spread quickly, capturing the hearts of everyone they met. Walter was often asked to share his tale, of how Patches had wandered into his life and how Scout had joined their little family. He spoke with pride and affection, his voice filled with love for the companions who had transformed his life. One particularly memorable stop was a small town in the Midwest, where a local newspaper ran a feature on Walter, Patches, and Scout. The article, titled "The Adventure of a Lifetime," told the story of their journey and the bond that had brought them together. It wasn't long before their story went viral, spreading across social media and capturing the attention of people all over the world. Walter was overwhelmed by the response. Letters and messages poured in, filled with words of encouragement and admiration. Many shared their own stories of love and companionship, inspired by Walter and his cats. Walter read each one, his heart warmed by the kindness of strangers. Despite the newfound attention, Walter remained humble. For him, the journey wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about living fully and embracing the connections that made life meaningful. Patches and Scout, unaware of their growing celebrity, continued to bring joy and laughter to Walter's days, their antics a constant reminder of the simple pleasures in life. As their journey neared its end, Walter found himself reflecting on the path they had taken, the places they had seen, the people they had met, the memories they had created. It all felt like a dream, one that he was grateful to have lived. "You've given me more than I ever thought possible," he said one evening, his voice thick with emotion. "You've shown me that it's never too late to start again. Here's the 5th batch of 1,500 words to continue the story." Walter's journey with Patches and Scout had become more than just an adventure. It was a testament to the transformative power of love and companionship. As they neared the end of their travels, Walter felt a sense of fulfillment he hadn't known in years. The quiet loneliness that had once defined his days was now a distant memory, replaced by laughter, connection, and a renewed zest for life. One of their final stops was a small seaside town on the East Coast. The air was salty and crisp, and the sound of waves crashing against the shore filled the air. Walter parked the camper near a quiet stretch of beach, stepping out with Patches and Scout in tow. The cats, curious as ever, explored the sand, their tiny paws leaving delicate imprints behind. Walter found a spot near the water's edge, settling into a folding chair he had brought along. The view was breathtaking. The ocean stretched endlessly before him, its surface shimmering in the sunlight. Patches climbed onto his lap, her tail flicking lazily as she purred. Scout sat at his feet, her eyes wide as she watched seagulls swooping overhead. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Walter felt a deep sense of peace. He reached down to stroke Scout's fur, his voice soft as he spoke. "We've come a long way, haven't we? From that little park bench to here. Who would have thought?" Patches meowed in agreement, her green eyes half closed in contentment. Walter chuckled, his heart full. "I couldn't have done it without you too. You've made these years the best of my life." The next morning, as they prepared to leave the seaside town, a knock on the camper door startled Walter. He opened it to find a young couple standing outside holding a camera. "Excuse us," the woman said, her voice polite. "We saw your story online and recognized you. Would you mind if we took a photo with you and your cats?" Walter blinked in surprise but smiled warmly. "Of course," he said, stepping out with Patches and Scout. The cats, ever cooperative, posed patiently as the couple snapped a few pictures. "Your story has inspired us so much," the man said. "It's a reminder to appreciate the little things and cherish the time we have." The encounter left Walter feeling both humbled and grateful. It was strange to think that his quiet life had touched so many, but it was also deeply rewarding. He carried the couple's words with him as they continued their journey, a reminder of the impact small acts of love and kindness could have. Their final destination was a quiet cabin in the mountains, a place Walter had always dreamed of visiting. The air was cool and fresh, and the landscape was dotted with wildflowers and towering pines. The cabin, nestled at the edge of a clear, sparkling lake, felt like a haven, a place where Walter could rest and reflect on the journey they had taken. Walter spent his days fishing by the lake, Patches and Scout by his side. The cats seemed to love the tranquility of the mountains, often lounging in the sun or chasing butterflies in the tall grass. At night, the three of them would sit by the fire, the cabin filled with warmth and light. Walter often found himself staring into the flames, his mind replaying the moments that had brought them here. One evening, as the stars twinkled overhead, Walter spoke softly. "This feels like the perfect place to end our journey. A place to just be." Patches purred in agreement, curling up in his lap. Scout nestled beside him, her tiny body warm against his side. Walter smiled, his heart full. "You two have given me so much. I'll never be able to thank you enough." As the days turned into weeks, Walter found himself growing more introspective. He began writing down his thoughts, filling pages with stories of their travels and the lessons he had learned. He wrote about the moment he first met Patches, about the rainy day he found Scout, and about the countless memories they had created together. "I want people to know," he said one afternoon, as he scribbled in his notebook. "I want them to see what a difference a little love can make." His writing became a way to preserve their journey, a way to ensure that the bond they shared would never be forgotten. Patches often sat beside him as he wrote, her head resting on his arm as if offering encouragement. Scout, ever curious, would paw at the pages, leaving tiny imprints that made Walter laugh. One day, as Walter sat by the lake with Patches and Scout, a young woman approached them. She introduced herself as a local journalist, explaining that she had heard about their story and wanted to write a feature about them for the town's newspaper. Walter, though surprised, agreed. The interview was a heartfelt exchange, with Walter sharing the story of how Patches and Scout had come into his life and transformed it. He spoke about the joy they had brought him, the adventures they had shared, and the way they had taught him to live fully again. The journalist listened intently, her eyes shining with admiration. When the article was published, it resonated deeply with readers. Letters and messages poured in once more, filled with stories of how Walter's journey had inspired others to adopt pets, to cherish their loved ones, and to find joy in the simple moments. Walter read each one, his heart swelling with gratitude. As the seasons changed and the leaves turned golden, Walter began to feel the weight of his years more acutely. His steps grew slower, and his time spent by the lake became more frequent. Patches and Scout stayed by his side, their presence a constant source of comfort and love. One crisp autumn evening, as the three of them sat on the porch of the cabin, Walter spoke softly. "This has been the adventure of a lifetime," he said, his voice tinged with both joy and wistfulness. "I couldn't have asked for better companions." Patches purred, her head resting against his hand. Scout nuzzled his leg, her eyes filled with trust and affection. Walter smiled, his heart full of peace. "You've given me more than I ever thought possible." "Thank you." As the crisp autumn days gave way to the chill of winter, Walter found himself spending more time indoors. The cabin, with its cozy fire and warm wooden walls, became a sanctuary for him and his two loyal companions. Patches and Scout seemed to sense the change in Walter. They stayed closer than ever, curling up beside him as he rested or following him from room to room, their quiet presence a source of constant comfort. Walter often found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this point. He would sit by the fire, his old notebook in hand, flipping through the pages filled with memories and musings. Each entry told a story, a moment of connection, a lesson learned, a reminder of the joy and meaning that had come into his life when Patches first appeared. "I never thought I'd live a life like this," he said softly one evening, stroking Patches' fur as she purred in his lap. Scout lay at his feet, her small body rising and falling with each breath. "You two have made me believe in second chances." As the first snowfall of the season blanketed the mountains, Walter decided to write a letter, a message to the world, inspired by the journey he had taken with his two feline companions. He sat at the small wooden table by the window, the light of the fire casting a warm glow on the page as he began to write. "To whoever reads this," he wrote, his hand steady despite the years etched into his skin. "I want to share a story, not just about a man and two cats, but about love, resilience, and the beauty of unexpected connections. Patches and Scout taught me something I never thought I'd learn at my age. That life is never truly over as long as you're willing to open your heart." Walter paused, glancing at Patches, who was perched on the windowsill, her green eyes fixed on the falling snow. Scout was curled up in her favorite spot by the fire, her tiny paws tucked beneath her. The sight of them filled Walter with a deep sense of gratitude. "They came into my life when I needed them most," he continued. "Patches, with her brave little heart, showed me that even the smallest acts of kindness can create a bond that changes everything. And Scout reminded me that there's always room for more love, no matter how full your heart already feels." Walter finished the letter late that night, folding it carefully and placing it in an envelope. He addressed it to the editor of the local newspaper, hoping that his words might inspire others to find joy in the simple, unexpected moments of life. The next morning, he braved the cold to mail it, Patches and Scout watching from the window as he walked down the snowy path. Over the next few weeks, Walter received an outpouring of responses from readers who had seen his letter published in the newspaper. Strangers wrote to share their own stories of love and connection, many inspired to adopt pets or reconnect with loved ones. Walter read each letter with tears in his eyes, his heart swelling with the knowledge that his story had made a difference. One particularly snowy evening, Walter sat by the fire, Patches and Scout curled up beside him. The cabin was quiet, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the soft hum of the wind outside. Walter felt a deep sense of peace, a rare, precious kind of contentment that he hadn't known in years. He closed his eyes, his thoughts drifting to Mary and the life they had shared. He imagined her sitting beside him, her laughter filling the room as Patches and Scout played at her feet. "You would have loved them," he whispered, a soft smile on his lips. They would have loved you, too. As the weeks passed, Walter's health began to decline. He moved more slowly, his energy waning, but his spirit remained strong. Patches and Scout never left his side, their bond with Walter unshakable. They seemed to sense his needs, offering comfort with their purrs and affection with their gentle nudges. One quiet morning, as the sun rose over the snow-covered mountains, Walter sat in his favorite chair by the window. Patches was in his lap, her warm body a soothing presence, while Scout rested on the arm of the chair, her head nestled against his shoulder. Walter gazed out at the serene landscape, his heart full of gratitude for the life he had lived. "I've been blessed," he said softly, his voice filled with emotion. "More than I ever deserved." That evening, as the fire crackled and the stars twinkled above the cabin, Walter closed his eyes for the last time. He passed peacefully, surrounded by the love and warmth that Patches and Scout had brought into his life. The two cats stayed by his side, their quiet vigil a testament to the bond they shared. News of Walter's passing spread quickly through the community. The townsfolk, many of whom had been touched by his story, came together to honor his memory. They spoke of his kindness, his resilience, and the way he had shown the world that even the smallest creatures could change a life. Patches and Scout were adopted by a kind neighbor, a young woman who had often visited Walter and his cats. She took them into her home, ensuring they were loved and cared for. The two cats quickly adjusted to their new surroundings, their bond with each other as strong as ever. Though they missed Walter, they carried his love with them, a lasting legacy of the life they had shared. Walter's story continued to inspire others long after his passing. The notebook he had filled with memories and reflections was published as a book, titled Patches, Scout, and Me, A Journey of Love and Second Chances. It became a bestseller, touching the hearts of readers around the world. Years later, a statue was erected in the park where Walter had first met Patches. It depicted an old man sitting on a bench, a kitten in his lap and another by his side. The plaque beneath it read, "In loving memory of Walter, Patches, and Scout. A story of love, hope, and the bonds that last forever." The statue became a place of reflection, a reminder of the extraordinary power of kindness and connection. Visitors would often leave flowers or notes, sharing their own stories of love and companionship. The park, once a quiet and ordinary place, had become a symbol of hope and inspiration. And so, the story of Walter, Patches, and Scout lived on, a beautiful testament to the way love can transform even the loneliest of lives. Though Walter was gone, his spirit remained in the hearts of all who had been touched by his journey. And for Patches and Scout, the little kitten who had first wandered into the park and the shy stray who had joined them along the way, his love was a legacy that would never fade. As the years passed, Walter's story continued to ripple through the lives of those who had heard it. The park where his statue stood became more than a tribute. It became a gathering place for people who sought solace, connection, or simply a moment of quiet reflection. Parents would bring their children to sit on the bench beside the statue, sharing the tale of the man and his two cats who had changed so many lives. Among the visitors was the young journalist who had first interviewed Walter at the cabin. She often came to the park, sitting quietly with her notebook, watching as others interacted with the statue. Inspired by Walter's journey, she had dedicated her career to telling stories of resilience and love. "Walter taught me to see the beauty in the smallest moments," she would say when asked about her work. His story reminds us that kindness can change the world. One day, as she sat on the bench, she noticed a small child tugging at his mother's hand. The boy, no older than 5, pointed excitedly at the statue. "Mama," he said, his voice filled with wonder, "is that the man with the kittens?" His mother smiled, kneeling beside him. "Yes, sweetheart," she said, "that's Walter. He found a kitten named Patches in this very park, and she became his best friend." The boy's eyes widened. "And what happened next?" The mother chuckled softly. "Well, Patches brought so much love into Walter's life that when he found another kitten, Scout, he didn't hesitate to take her in, too. Together, they traveled the world, sharing their story and inspiring people everywhere. The boy nodded solemnly, as if committing the story to memory. "I want to be like Walter," he said. "I want to help animals, too." The journalist felt a lump in her throat as she listened. She jotted the moment down in her notebook, knowing that Walter's legacy was still alive and growing. Meanwhile, Patches and Scout thrived in their new home. The young woman who had adopted them, Amelia, cherished them deeply, ensuring they were loved and cared for. She often visited the park with the cats, carrying them in a special carrier so they could see the statue of Walter. Patches would nuzzle the base of the statue, her green eyes bright with recognition, while Scout sat quietly, her tail curling around her feet. Amelia had always been an animal lover, but Patches and Scout had taught her something deeper. They showed her the strength of bonds formed in the face of hardship and the joy that came from giving and receiving unconditional love. Inspired by their story, Amelia began volunteering at a local animal shelter, dedicating her time to helping strays find loving homes. One day, while working at the shelter, Amelia met a man named Sam. He had come in looking to adopt a cat, his warm smile and gentle demeanor immediately putting her at ease. As they spoke, Amelia found herself sharing Walter's story, her voice filled with emotion as she recounted the bond between the old man and his two cats. Sam listened intently, his eyes lighting up as he said, "I've heard that story before. My mother read me the book about Walter and his cats when I was a kid. It's one of the reasons I wanted to adopt." Amelia felt a spark of connection in that moment. Over time, their shared love for animals and the inspiration they drew from Walter's story brought them closer. They began working together at the shelter, their bond growing stronger with each passing day. Years later, Amelia and Sam opened their own animal sanctuary, naming it Walter's Haven in honor of the man who had inspired them both. The sanctuary became a safe haven for animals in need, a place where love and compassion were at the heart of everything they did. Patches and Scout, now in their twilight years, became the sanctuary's unofficial mascots, their presence a reminder of the journey that had started it all. Walter's Haven quickly became known for its innovative programs, including a reading initiative where children would read stories to the animals, helping shy or anxious pets feel more comfortable around people. The sanctuary also offered educational workshops, teaching visitors about the importance of kindness and the transformative power of love. One summer, the sanctuary hosted a special event to celebrate Walter's legacy. People from all over the country came to share their stories of how Walter, Patches, and Scout had inspired them. There were families who had adopted pets because of Walter's book, individuals who had started volunteering at shelters, and even artists who had created works inspired by the trio's journey. Among the attendees was the young journalist, now a successful author herself. She had written a follow-up book about the impact of Walter's story, documenting the lives it had touched and the ripple effect it had created. As she stood on the sanctuary stage, addressing the crowd, she said, "Walter once told me that even the smallest acts of kindness could change a life. Today, we see just how true that is." His story reminds us that love, in all its forms, has the power to transform not just individuals but entire communities. As the event drew to a close, Amelia and Sam stood together, Patches in Amelia's arms and Scout resting at Sam's feet. They looked out at the crowd, their hearts full as they thought of Walter and the legacy he had left behind. "Do you think he ever imagined this?" Amelia asked, her voice soft. Sam smiled. "Maybe not, but I think he'd be proud. He'd be happy knowing that his story is still inspiring people." Amelia nodded, her eyes misting over. "He would. He taught us all what it means to love without limits." As the years went on, Walter's Haven continued to grow, its mission of love and compassion reaching more people and animals than anyone could have imagined. Patches and Scout, though no longer by Amelia and Sam's side, were remembered as the heart of the sanctuary, their bond with Walter a symbol of the incredible power of connection. And though Walter himself was gone, his spirit lived on in the lives he had touched, the stories he had shared, and the legacy he had built. His journey with Patches and Scout had shown the world that even the smallest creatures could make the biggest difference, and that love, when given freely and unconditionally, could change everything. The story of Walter, Patches, and Scout became a timeless tale, passed down through generations as a beacon of hope and inspiration. And as the sun set over Walter's haven, casting the sanctuary in a golden glow, it was clear that their bond, their journey, and their legacy would live on forever.